When we consider our approach towards alignment in a reward system, one of the most tangible features of that approach towards alignment is in the development of a pay structure. A pay structure lies underneath that gives tangible expression to the hierarchy that we think is appropriate for our organisation. Which people in the organisation are at the bottom, of least value, of least contribution to the organisation and its sources of success, and which are at the top, and where does everybody else fit in between. So the design of a pay structure is a key decision, a key set of decisions in terms of putting into place our strategic direction for the alignment aspects of reward design within an organisation. So how do we fulfill this effectively? What kinds of choices do we need to think about in terms of our approach towards alignment? How does that look in terms of our design decisions that influence the way in which our pay structure will look? Now, there are a number of key questions that we need to consider when we're thinking about how we put in place such a pay structure. First and foremost, we need to think about how this kind of structure might support the workflow within an organisation. Now, it's important to start with this kind of choice because it brings us back to the reasons why we're trying to put in place a coherent and consistent reward structure in the first place. The idea of workflow is about the way in which all of the different aspects of activity within an organisation come together and support the organisation in its ability to be able to produce the goods and services that it is intended to exist for, to provide the goods and services that it then attempts to tender in the marketplace. So the extent to which a pay structure is supportive of the way in which we want people to work together, the efforts at cooperation, about how one activity joins with another, about how one kind of work helps to support another kind of work, how all these different aspects of the organisation fit together. If the pay structure doesn't support and doesn't reinforce and doesn't encourage the achievement of that kind of workflow, then you have to question, well, of what earthly use is it? Because that is the very basis of what the pay structure is for. Beyond its ultimate function, which is to reinforce the behaviours and the activities that we want the workforce to undertake, then there is also an implicit requirement for the pay structure to be regarded as fair. Now, fairness in the design of a pay structure is of fundamental importance because the pay structure is so fundamental to rewards generally. For most normal types of reward systems, base pay is the primary element, the pay that you get for doing the job, your wage, your salary. Over and above, whatever else you get in terms of bonuses or incentives or benefits and pensions, any of those kinds of things, the base pay sits at the very base of it. It is fundamentally how you are valued, how your contribution to the organisation is recognised. Now, of course, there are certain types of jobs, sales jobs that are heavily dependent upon incentive payments or commission, those kinds of things that are unusual, and they would be slightly different. But for most normal jobs, your base pay is most important, and that is what the pay structure reflects. So where you are in the pay structure is fundamentally important to your perception of worth. And so therefore it becomes a very important aspect of whether you feel that your worth is fair in terms of what you contribute to the organisation. Again, going back to equity theory and Adams, who talked about this process of comparison, that we're always constantly comparing our contribution to the organisation and what we receive for that, and what we perceive others do and what they get in return. And we balance out. Now, a pay structure tangibly expresses that contribution and that reward. This is where you are in the hierarchy, in the pecking order. And if you don't feel that's right, then that can become a very fundamental source of dissatisfaction, of demotivation. So the outcome of a pay structure, where you ultimately are placed in that hierarchy, is a very important part of how fair you think that your rewards are. And this expresses a form of fairness that we call distributive justice. Just how just are the outcomes of these systems? Was the outcome, where you exist in that pay structure, do you think that is right? Do you think that reflects what you think you deserve? There is another aspect of fairness that's related to this, which is called procedural justice. And procedural justice is less concerned with, well, what was the outcome, rather than what was the process. So we may not like where we end up, but actually, if we feel that the way in which those decisions were reached was fair and transparent and defensible, then we may still end up feeling that overall the outcome is fair. So procedural justice is actually very important in terms of our sense of how fair particular aspects of rewards might be. So that's the second aim of a pay structure, to be fair. And there are a couple of different ways that, as I say, we can achieve that fairness. The third aim of a pay structure is the extent to which the pay structure directs employees' behaviour towards the objectives of the organisation. If we remember and recall, one of the strategic aims of reward systems is to be able to direct behaviour in this way, that organisations can think very clearly about, well, what is it that we need people to be able to do? How do we need people to behave in order for us to succeed as an organisation? And then to be able to put in place the systems and processes, in this case, the rewards that encourage, motivate, and direct people's behaviour in line with those strategic objectives. So ideally, what we should have in our pay structure is a very clear line of sight, a very clear relationship between the rewards that people receive and the espoused objectives of the organisation, so that the pay structure rewards people who are seen to contribute more towards those strategically useful activities and rather less towards people who contribute less towards those strategically useful or important activities. So the more consistency that we have in our pay structure in matching those things, that the key rewards go to the key behaviours for the organisation, then the more consistent our approach towards having a strategically rooted reward system will be. So those are the three key aims of a pay structure. And the way in which we might express those aims will be many and varied. There are all kinds of different varieties of pay structures that we might see out there in organisations. So there are a few different ways in which we might differentiate different approaches towards designing a reward structure. And obviously the way in which all of those choices combine results in a huge amount of diversity in the form that pay structures take. So the first approach, the first kind of differentiation that we might see in pay structures will be in the number of levels that the pay structure has within it. Now, A pay structure, as is implied by its name, is a way of structuring the workforce, of dividing the workforce. But we have choices into how many divisions we might want to put in place, how many levels the pay structure is going to have. Now that might reflect a design choice, that there are different behaviours that tend to result from having a structure with rather fewer or rather lesser levels. And we may design our structure deliberately in order to encourage or discourage those particular types of behaviour. And this gets reflected in a more general choice that I'll talk about in a minute, which we term the degree of hierarchy or the degree of equality within the system. So how hierarchical or how egalitarian we want our pay structure to be will be reflected in how many levels we choose to design into it. But it may also be that our pay structure will necessarily have a certain number of levels, or will have relatively more or relatively less levels, simply because it is reflecting the reality of the organisation that it's seeking to reflect. That some organisations are simply more complex than others, that some organisations contain many different types of work, many different types of behaviours, many different types of worker, and so therefore fitting them all into a structure with only a few levels, a very flat structure, would simply be inappropriate. So the nature of the organisation will necessarily have an impact upon what the pay structure will look like in terms of how many levels we design into it. We also need to think about the differences between each level. Now, again, this reflects these broad design choices between a hierarchical approach and an egalitarian approach. If we have a pay structure which has a very large gap between the levels of pay for those jobs that are at the bottom of the structure and those at the top of the structure, then we tend to see that the pay structure is quite stretched. The gaps between each level in the structure, the jump in level of pay from going from one point in the structure to the next, is quite big. Now, by comparison, we might have a pay structure which deals with the same type of employees, but we make a choice to limit, to compress the levels of pay. So there's a smaller gap between jobs at the bottom and jobs at the top in terms of the pay that they attract, and consequently smaller jumps in levels of pay between one level and the next. So a smaller gap is more egalitarian. Bigger gaps, hierarchical. Now these have different behavioural implications, very profound behavioural implications. The number of levels that we build in, the size of the gaps between those levels. If we have big gaps between the levels and lots of jumps, we're implicitly encouraging promotion-seeking behaviour. We're encouraging people to climb that ladder. We're setting it out in front of them and encouraging them to behave in ways that will achieve promotion. We are encouraging people to behave competitively, individualistically, rather than cooperatively and collectively. By comparison, if we build a pay structure which is compressed, where more people will be on common rates of pay, where there's less incentive to move from one level of the pay structure to the next because the pay increases are not so attractive, they don't invite us to put ourselves through the torment of seeking promotion, then the kind of behaviours encouraged by that type of pay structure are more cooperative, more collective, more team-based types of behaviours. So you can see this isn't simply a matter of preference, but a question of what is appropriate. What kind of behaviours make sense for our organisation? what fits with our broad strategic objectives? What kinds of behaviours do we want to see? So how big should those differentials be? Particularly important between one pay level and the next, between adjacent pay levels. What should the pay differences be between a member of a team and the leader of a team? How big a gap should that be? You know, what kind of relationship do we want between those types of employees? So big design choices about how many levels and the size of the gaps, the size of the differentials. Two final structural differentiators. The first being what criteria we use to place people within these pay structures. Traditionally, organisations have focused on jobs because jobs have been the traditional unit of organisational life forever. We define people by jobs. Their job description is already set out, so it becomes a very clear reference point, a very easily defensible and kind of quantifiable reference point with which to separate one group of people in an organisation from another. But there are alternatives. We might attempt to differentiate people by skill or competence, and that this might reflect a desire to allow people to express themselves more, that by defining them by the job that they do, restricts them to the job that we've designed for them, rather than allows them to express what they're actually capable of. So the criteria that we use, jobs, competence, or skill, is a very important decision to make. And also how tight or loose we want to define that relationship. How much scope do we have for people to work beyond their job description? How tightly constrained do we want to define somebody in relation to their job? Now, a very tightly constrained approach will encourage people to operate effectively and efficiently. Somebody who works in a fast food restaurant, we want them to follow fixed instructions in a very limited number of scenarios so that they're efficient. Throughput's very important in that kind of situation. But in a more creative field, that kind of restriction will be counterproductive. We don't want to hem people in with a very strict job description saying that is the limit of what you are expected to do. We want people to go beyond. And so we want a looser definition of what it is to be your kind of employee. So we have these choices. And as I say, they tend to get expressed as structures which are rather more or rather less hierarchical, rather more or rather less egalitarian. Now, the theory that underpins each of these approaches, the reason why we might choose one rather than the other, are two different approaches to motivation. Egalitarian approaches are underpinned by a lot of the things that we've talked about previously, like equity theory, the fact that we compare, and where those comparisons seem out of joint, it has a detrimental effect on performance. So if we want people to work together but have their rates of pay being very different, then that might create divisions and barriers to effective cooperation. And so we might rather seek to have a more egalitarian pay structure so that it encourages more effortless, frictionless approach to team working. A hierarchical approach is underpinned more by tournament theory. The idea that when we look at the potential prizes, the potential rewards on offer, the greater the gap between our current rewards and the next one, the more strongly motivated we'll be to reach that next point. And if we want people to strive, to succeed, to excel, to shine, to be a star, then a hierarchical job pay structure will support that. And tournament theory tells us that human behaviour is indeed directed in that way. It's simply a question of identifying what kinds of behaviours are appropriate for our organisation. What do we think is right for us? Now, that's a strategic question, but there's also a moral or ethical dimension to this as well. To what extent do we think it's right that there should be a very large gap between different levels in an organisation? Or to what extent are we swayed by the more moral arguments of equality as being a good thing in itself? These considerations are the things that we need to think about in the broad design choices, the approaches that we take towards alignment.